All right, I'd like to bring this workshop for the West Dallas West Milwaukee School Board to order. Suzette, can you please get the roll?
Yes. Mr. Sikich is excused. Ms. Deal.
Present.
Mr. Burns.
Present.
Mr. Ustruck.
Here.
I believe Mrs. Justum is on her way. Mrs. Carr.
Here.
Mrs. Kaiser.
Here.
Mr. Keller.
Here.
President Lee.
Here. All right, so today we have a workshop, our first workshop on the Facilities Advisory Committee. And we are going to learn about all of the work that they have done over the last many months. And so, Dr. Lexman on the Zoom. Otherwise, I will, well, it says Dr. Lexman and Mr. Mike. Who should I turn it over to?
Well, if Mr. Eichmann is on, we can start with him.
Steve there? Steve, are you there? Do we gotta turn this on?
He was on mute.
Oh, he was on mute?
I see him on this monitor here.
Oh, he's talking.
Yeah, he's talking, we can't. I think we gotta turn this up again, yeah. Steve?
Yep, I can.
Yeah,
Yep.
we can jump in.
So I'll just start by reviewing our timeline and our instructions of our awesome consultants who are with us tonight. We're gonna play musical chairs up here because we have to speak into our microphones. So tonight is our first of three. We're doing a speed version of what we did with our fact team over the last 6 months. Tonight we'll review all the foundational work we did, which is going to seem very quick, and all of our resources are linked online. We'll review the site building considerations that we worked through with as a fact team, and then we'll have group discussion. So as we go through the presentation tonight, you have post-its in front of you. As you have questions, jot them down, so you'll hold your questions till the end essentially. I'll collect post-its kind of as we go throughout. And then there will be a few times which we'll go through in our agenda for tonight, times for small group discussion, and then we'll come back as a whole group at the end for large group discussion. So that's what tonight looks like. Our second meeting is Monday, August 2nd. So we'll review our preliminary conceptual designs, preliminary cost estimates, and the fact team recommendation for our board. And then we will talk through our community survey process, which we believe is our next step here throughout our fact team and facilities analysis. And then again, have group discussion. And then our third meeting is Monday, August 16th, where we will kind of dig into that board recommendation and next steps in terms of a survey and further discussion. So that's what we're looking at in our next 3 meetings. Again, it's going to seem like we're doing a lot of information in a short amount of time because we are, and all resources are linked online from all of our presentations from FACT throughout the last 6 months. So moving through our introductions of our Bray and C.G. Schmidt team here tonight. So Matt Wolfert is joining me, sitting next to me, and we also have Mark Lillisand, his vice president, in the back over here with C.G. Schmidt. And then Mike Clark is here from Baird as well. So thank you to our consultants who are joining us. They have been really leading this work throughout the last over a year and a half. So I'll pass it on to Matt to talk through next slides.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good to see all of you again. Welcome to some new board members who haven't been on this journey with us as long as we've been at it. So excited to begin the process of more in-depth conversation at the board level regarding the work that the FAC committee has done over the past 17 months. It's critically important to remind everybody, those here and obviously those in the audience listening tonight, that the Community Advisory Committee, the community team that met for the past 6 months, really is the foundation for what is being brought forward tonight. We'll talk a lot about how they influence the process. They played an essential role. As you can see on the screen, they met 10 times. There's 40 members, and approximately 800 hours of collective effort have gone in by members of your school, parents, staff members, others that have volunteered their time to lay the foundation for the board to have a conversation with the broader community about facility needs and next steps. So critically important work that FACT did and are excited to be sharing on their behalf this evening. There's been a lot of work that's gone into this process, and as Caitlin said, all of this information is linked. Your new website's great. It's right on the front homepage, one of the first six big icons you see on the new webpage. It's also linked throughout this document. You can see small blue hyperlinks on the bottom of many of these slides. We good? All right, sorry about that. And so all of this information is readily available. So every meeting, every summary of the meeting, all the information presented and provided, completely transparent and open for anybody to spend some time with. Happy for you as board members. Again, we're going to summarize this evening. Not that we're trying to hide any of the detail. It's all here. It's all available, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions you or community members might have about it. So where we're at right now, we're in that summer 2021 timeframe. The FAC committee has done their work. We've wrapped up the initial round of option and solution exploration. As Caitlin noted, in meeting 2 and meeting 3 with the board, we're going to have involvement from the community survey firm that the district has hired, School Perceptions. So they will be sharing the process at our next meeting, and then a draft of a potential community survey with you at our final work session. And so that process is ongoing, and we look forward to you learning more about that as we move forward. So guiding principles were a huge part of the process, and these principles really grew out of a lot of conversation before we began with FACT. And really the goals here are to talk about how do we inspire and shape education of our children and communities with renovated or replaced or consolidated schools. So a critically important conversation they had was always regrounding our conversations around how our investments in facilities, or could investments in facilities, going to benefit students, benefits teaching and learning moving forward. And it's an important piece. These conversations can be emotional. There's a lot of different constituencies and representatives in the room during the FAC meetings, and so these were really important to make sure that we were always grounded in making sure we did what was right for students and for our communities. And then we were always also reminded that we needed to be as cost effective as we can for our community. Cost is a critically important piece of any conversation, and we'll be talking a lot about that, I'm sure, as we move further along. So we'll start tonight by reviewing the FACT Foundation work. And for prior board members, some of this is a refresh on presentations we've delivered. For new board members, apologize if we're going too quick, that's not the intention. We're more than happy to take any questions you may have about this. So the process really began with an exhaustive existing building assessment. This is a document that, again, is available on the district's website. It involves over 600 pages, along with additional engineer reports, really diving deep into each of your existing buildings. So 23 total buildings, 11 elementaries, 3 intermediates, 2 high schools, a project-based high school, and then 6 additional supplementary buildings. So a lot of work went into just understanding what we have as a district and what needs that those buildings currently face. The average age of your school buildings is over 75 years old. That is not inherently unusual for a district of this age, of this type, in this geography. But the districts and the buildings do have needs. So as we've talked a lot initially, we have building system infrastructure needs. These are not things that are born out of neglect. They're simply born out of age. Buildings that have really served you well, and your district team has done a great job maintaining them. The schools are clean, they're safe. It's just some of the equipment has aged, and in many cases aged to the point where significant replacements are needed, not repairs any longer. We also studied existing building capacity. So on the screen you can see quick summaries of the capacity of each of the elementary schools, the 2020-2021 enrollment at that building, and then in this case, how far under capacity each of those school buildings are. Same thing with our intermediate and high schools. So again, all but Hale in this case, we're showing as having excess capacity of our buildings. And then in summary, really, we're looking at about a 1,500 seat excess capacity that you're currently operating across the district. So again, just another lens to look at our schools through. We looked at them through all the lenses of building systems, infrastructure, ADA, all those critically important pieces. We looked at them then through capacity. So those are the first two lenses that we looked at the facilities through, and in fact spent a lot of time understanding those needs and used that as we began to evaluate potential solutions, which we'll start getting into next. So I'm going to pass this to Caitlin to talk about school finance.
Thanks, Matt. So school finance is a multi-day topic that we're going to cover in 4 slides. So this is, again, super high level. And we will go through, one of the next times we'll go through this more in depth is our annual meeting in September. We'll talk through kind of start to finish in terms of formulas from revenue limit all the way through our budget to our mill rate. So tonight we'll talk at a super high level and start with revenue limit. So approximately 83% of our district's revenue comes from the revenue limit formula. It's a state formula, we do not dictate it. And that is the dollars that we get by way of property taxes and state aid. So 83% of our total revenue comes from the revenue limit formula. It is very complex, but it can be boiled down to a fairly straightforward calculation, which is our resident membership, FTE, times a per pupil amount, plus exemptions. So there are 2 categories of exemptions. There's one-time exemptions and ongoing exemptions, and that equals our total revenue limit authority. So one of those key factors in that calculation is our resident membership, and so therefore, as school districts experience declining enrollment, over time, our revenue limit formula, or our revenue limit total dollars, will decrease over time as well. So you can see there, the graph depicts our resident membership over time, over the last few years, and it is decreasing. So that in turn affects our total revenue limit authority. The exemptions that you see as part of that calculation, the one-time and ongoing exemptions, that is a key piece that sort of softens the blow of declining enrollment, so it provides us with additional dollars, but still over time we see that revenue limit decline as our enrollment declines, which is a key piece of our total budget. Another key factor in our school story especially is our credit rating. So our credit rating really reflects the progress that we've made over the years and how far we've come, and that we're in a completely different place than we were 5 years ago. So just like many private organizations, our school district also has a credit rating. So back in 2018, our credit rating with Moody's was in a category called junk bonds, which is not where anybody wants to be. We were at a BA1 credit score. So we made a lot of progress over the years, and we had a call with S&P where they reviewed our credit rating and reviewed, over an hour-and-a-half phone call where they essentially grill us on all facets of our financial planning and long-term planning and budgeting and forecasting, et cetera, and have increased our credit score to the high grade with S&P, and we're at a AA-. So that is incredibly impressive for a school district to make that amount of gain in such a short amount of time, and really does reflect that we're in a good place at this time. About 58% of school districts are at or above that high grade, and 42% are below high grade. So we're in pretty good company up there with our new credit score. And with this credit rating, it enabled us to do a few things. And one of them was really important for our community, our taxpayers, and the other was really important for our actual school operating budget. So when we refinanced, by having this increased credit rating, we're able to decrease the amount of levy that we had for our taxpayers. So when we did that, that created over $800,000 of savings for our taxpayers because we had increased credit score, with that refinancing, then we were able to make that savings of over $800,000. And then inside our revenue limit, we saw an interest savings, which essentially freed up $186,000 inside our revenue limit, which that means those are operating dollars that we're going to pay interest and instead can go right into our classrooms. So that the credit rating is a huge piece of our puzzle and our story. Next, we'll talk through mill rates. So the mill rate essentially is the rate that that's identified that is the school district portion of a homeowner's property tax bill. So again, the big picture is that we have a revenue limit. The state tells us how much aid we get. So we take our revenue limit less our state aid, and that's our tax levy. We add in our Fund 80 portion of our tax levy, and then we take that levy divided by our equalized property values to get our mill rate. So our mill rate, as you can see here, has been declining over the last decade, with the exception of 17-18. So again, that's part of the complex piece of the school finance puzzle, but in the year before, we received a large settlement, and so that additional revenue decreased our aid, which increased our property taxes in the 17-18 year. So that's why we see our mill rate jump that year. It was a one-time implication of the revenue that we received the previous year. Aside from that, we can see our revenue has been decreasing over the last decade. And in addition, as we've talked through in previous budget workshops, our mill rate for the next year, 21-22, is projected at $8.21. So that's again another 50-cent decrease off the most recent bar you see on this graph, which means next year in 2021, we'll be at full $1.50 under where we sat on average over the last decade in terms of our mill rate. And then we get talking about hypothetical tax impacts. So this is the fun slide. And all these have the little Baird logo because Mr. Mike Clark over here was able to put these together and worked through these with the FACT team. So I'm just going through them at a high level. Again, a kind of a speed version of what we did with the FACT team. But these hypothetical tax impacts are what we just talked through, the mill rates, how a referendum could impact our mill rate moving forward. So we can see there that a hypothetical $50 million referendum might have a 39-cent increase to our mill rate over what we currently show in that bar graph on the previous slide. A $100 million referendum could be a 97% mill rate increase over what we currently project. A $150 million referendum could be $1.55 on top of our mill rate, and a $200 referendum could be $2.13 over our mill rate. So we break it down, then what does that actually mean for an individual homeowner? It's based on the value of your home. So what that mill rate means is it's the dollars for every $1,000 worth of equalized value. So let's go on the high end. The $200 million referendum as a $2.13 mill rate increase from what we just looked at on the bar graphs there. For a home that's valued at $100,000 of equalized value, that maximum impact annually then is $213. Divide that by 12 for a monthly impact, that's $17.75 additional dollars that homeowner would pay in property taxes. If we look at a $200,000 property, again, this is just math, the $2.13 mill rate impact on a $200,000 home is an annual increase of $426 on the property tax bill. Monthly, that equates to $35.50. And then for a $300,000 property, we look at that $2.13 increase. That annually would be $639 in terms of a mill rate increase. And then monthly, that boils down to $53.25 more that a homeowner would pay if a referendum of $200 million was passed. It would be a $2 approximate 13-cent increase on the projected mill rate for that year. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Mr. Steve Eichmann, who's going to work through our enrollment analysis and projections. We can't hear Steve. Steve, give us 1 sec. Brandon's coming over to turn up our microphone. Yep, we can hear you now, so you're good to go.
All right. Once again, I'm Mark Lillsand, and I'm going to go through the Capital Improvement Plan, or CIP, which is what we call it sometimes. So briefly tonight, I'm going to go through, starting with what was included and not included in some of the costs that you'll see. We're going to go through, you'll see the school-by-school breakdown of where the capital improvement costs came in. And then we'll end with an example, or I'll go into a little bit of detail of just some of the buckets of where the costs were coming from that made up those total dollars. Once again, these were just numbers that we put together that are to keep the facilities in good working condition, and we'll spend some more time going through that. It was based on the report that Matt talked about that Bray put together, the facilities condition report. Our team walked the site, and then we talked to Steve Eichmann and his crew to make sure we understood if there were any other items that maybe we didn't see that they were aware of that we captured. And then looking at things like the roofing report that they have, that the district has, as well as the pavement replacement reports. So that's kind of what went into the capital improvement from a analysis standpoint. So what it does not include, or what it does include, is it includes all of the design, engineering, testing, and construction costs. It was based on inflation up to the year of 2023 only. This was done before the hyperinflation that we've just gone through, but we all sense that this is going to come back down. So the budgets that we put together are based on typical and usual inflations. We included the abatement costs for each of the facilities. And then sometimes there's just a little bit of peripheral work that is for some of the adjacent areas as you're doing some renovations. So we included some costs there, and a small contingency for working in older buildings. So we wanted to make sure we had some funds there. What's not included is the wall removal or reconfiguration. This wasn't gut and remodel and redoing. It did not include furniture replacement, IT upgrades, or there were some items that were listed as maintenance on the report, so we said that that would be done by the facilities team. This first slide here is a breakdown of the elementary schools, of the 11 elementary schools. The total capital improvement cost for the elementary schools was $114,512,000. So on average in the elementary schools, if you look at them as a big bucket, that's about $10 million in per facility. But it does vary based on the condition of each school. Next up we broke out the intermediate school buildings, the Frank Lloyd Wright, Lane, and West Milwaukee Intermediate. Those totaled $49,278,000. The 3 high school buildings totaled $72,490,000. And then there's some other additional supplemental buildings that the district owns that total $11,876,000. And so for those of you that have been totaling these up, this last slide summarizes all of these, but it totals $248,159,000. So what I wanted to do is just to spend a little bit of time to go one level deeper to show the analysis that we put together with looking at the CIP. The first bucket we had was at hazardous materials management and removal. So we had a firm that looked at each facility, and they identified what lead, asbestos removals that would have to occur. If construction were to occur, then you have to remediate some of those. They're fine the way that they are right now. But that's the first bucket. The second one is there are some schools that may have had like a crack that it would suggest some foundation pieces. This school did not have anything that was very significant that way. But that's what that next bucket was for, which is general. Then there's the exterior and enclosure piece. A lot of that is related to, could be related to replacing a roof, replacing the parking lot, windows, doors, or brick touching up on the outside of the buildings. The next bucket is the interior section. And this is what Matt had mentioned. There's some ADA pieces, upgrades that would have to occur in some of the facilities. So a lot of that ended up here. But there are some, ceilings and flooring that are just kind of past their useful life that would have to be replaced, and that's part of what's in there as well. The next 4 sections are related to the infrastructure that Matt kind of mentioned in the beginning: fire protection, plumbing, mechanical, and electrical. This is a little more detail on 3 of those, but we did look at putting in a new sprinkler system from a safety standpoint into all the facilities. So you'll see a line item if you get into detail the CIP for that. From a plumbing standpoint, a lot of them, just based on the age, the pipes need to be removed and replaced. They're just at that point. And then some of the systems that supply the plumbing as well. We did also look at, in the reports, it suggested to replace the plumbing fixtures, the sinks and toilets, and so that's a big part of that as well. From a mechanical standpoint, very similar discussion as well. When it comes to electrical, which isn't on here, the district did invest in LED lighting, so that's a really good upgrade that's already occurred that is not part of our capital improvement budget because it's already been done, so that was a good thing. But the panels are being suggested to be removed and relocated, or to be removed and replaced in some instances, and some of the wiring. Some of the systems, like the clocks, are all kind of past their useful life. So that's kind of the summary of what would be in the electrical. But it does vary school by school. I have the book on the desk back there. It's about this thick of all the detail if we want to look at it later. So that's it for the capital improvement plan.
And while Mark and Matt play musical chairs here, I'm just gonna connect this to our budget. So we lovingly call the CIP, in kind of throughout this process, our do nothing work, because this is work that has to happen regardless in our facilities, just to maintain our facilities. Mark went through our total of $248 million. Each year, our CIP budget, in our regular school district budget, is $1.2 million. So those numbers are very different. This $248 million is what we need to invest in our facilities to maintain them moving forward. $248 million, that's, and our regular budget is $1.2 million, what we put towards CIP each year. So again, just kind of to put this in perspective of what this means for our school district and our budget moving forward.
Thank you, Caitlin. And as Mark alluded to, same thing as you've seen all along. Prior slide had a link to the full capital improvement plan there. So if anybody's ever really bored and wants to spend a lot of time, look at the 600 pages of condition assessment and all the great work that Mark and his team did. There's a lot there, and it's critically important foundational work that we used as a fact group to transition into, I think, which is where most people want to start. Well, how do we address these challenges? That's the natural place you go when you start to understand some of the challenges that we're facing. And the way we began with FACT was laying out a series of parameters for each framework parameters that would be used to evaluate potential solutions. So in a way, you could think about this as if you were starting from scratch, didn't have a single school building, and you were planning a district for 7,500-ish students. What would you do? What grade configuration would you use? Where geographically would you locate schools? How many of each school type would you have? And so the parameters you have in front of you and on the screen really were targeting that projected enrollment of about 7,400 to 7,500 students, the commitment to maintain representation, in this case a school or buildings, in our communities, so West Dallas, West Milwaukee, and New Berlin. We have facilities in each of those communities now, and the goal would be to maintain that representation. Obviously, we talked about this earlier, fiscal responsibility. What could a consolidation look like in terms of improving operating expenses, avoiding some of those do-nothing costs associated with keeping some of our buildings online, and then also looking at what right-sizing our district for future enrollment would look like. Talked a lot about what transitions mean and how they affect students. Some research would suggest that a post-transition year, or in our world, the first year you're in a new building, can have a negative impact on students and on teaching and learning. So we worked through with the group a parameter of having no more than 2 transitions within any of the grade structures. The grade structures you see were the 4 primary grade structures that the FACT committee explored as we got into it. A great conversation was had about the predictability of pathways. If I move into an elementary school district, elementary school attendance area, do I know what intermediate school and or what high school I would be attending? I think it's a huge piece, not surprising that we had a lot of parent representation on our FACT committee, that was an important conversation that they wanted to have and we were able to align that. And then K4 shall be housed in each of the elementary schools, so that was a parameter that was used. And then a final couple pieces here, early childhood and our transition program for 18 to 21-year-old would be shared at a single location. So that's a specific, really specific bullet. Some of these are more macro, but it's still important. Students we're serving very effectively and need to make sure that the solutions take into account. And then finally, this was probably the biggest area of conversation was, should we commit long-term to 1 or 2 comprehensive high school buildings? And I will say there's always one small project-based learning, so in the current case, DOCI would be part of that conversation. So these framework parameters were used by FACT as we explored 9 different potential pathways. We're going to just briefly share one with you. Again, all 9 of these are available, linked here to the document for you to explore. We were very careful where we weren't acknowledging, they were simply called elementary, in this case 1 through 8. It wasn't, Smith Elementary, or we were not talking again about specific school buildings. We're staying at the macro level of what is the best long-term solution for West Allis, West Milwaukee in terms of grade configuration, quantity of schools, all the parameters we just talked through. So in this specific case, option 1A was a scenario that looked at K4 through 5th grade elementary schools. We would have 8 of those. It looked at 2 intermediate schools. And it looked at 2 high schools. You can see here, even just looking at the capacity of those schools, you would be smaller. As we know, we've been declining in enrollment. And as Steve Eichmann touched on, that trend is there, and we know have a better projection now based on the work Roffers did. But in this case, we would have 2 equal-size high schools. So there's a very linear progression there, 8 elementaries, 2 intermediate schools, 2 high schools, plus a project-based high school. So that's one example, and again, run through very quickly, but that's one example of a pathway in how we organize the conversation at the FACT level. The next slide in your book summarizes and I forget the total number, this is the 9 that we explored. There's pathway 1 through pathway 5 with a number of base options and sub-options of A's and B's within them. In general, that was 5 different grade configurations that were explored. So we just touched on pathway 1A, that would have been 4-year-old kindergarten through 5th grade, 6th through 8th grade, and then 9th through 12th grade. So pretty traditional, good delivery model, one we know, one that serves us well. So 1A and 1B, we're looking at options for that. Option 2A and 2B, we're looking at what a 4K through 8th grade, and then a 9th through 12th grade scenario could look like. 3A and 3B were 4K through 4th grade, 5th through 8th grade. Option 4 was K4 through 5th grade and then 6th through 12th grade. And then 5A and B were a combination of 4K through 5th grade and 4K through 8th grade buildings that would then feed 6th through 8th and 9th through 12th buildings. So again, 9 different pathways were looked at. You can generally see in summary form, some considered 2 comprehensive high schools, others considered 1 comprehensive high school as kind of a slight derivation on these options. All of them included the project-based learning high school, which was a key part of every one of these recommendations. And you can see here on the right that the building totals ranged from 9 schools to 13 schools, and then everything in between, depending on exactly how student populations and enrollments broke down, depending on the different grade levels. So that is a really quick summary of all of the work that the FACT committee did related to beginning to understand pathways and formulate their direction moving forward.
All right, so Deidre's going to kick us off into small groups. We are kind of performing this board meeting similar to how we did our faculty meeting. So oftentimes we would present information and then move into small group discussions, and generally these were in Zoom breakout rooms. Tonight we're going to meet in person into small groups that Deidre will walk us through tonight. If you already have any Post-its, I'm going to come around and grab your Post-its because we'll talk through those at the very end. And Deidre will kick us off into groups.
Hello, everyone. We put the groups up on the screen, and there are 3 tables set up kind of here, and at the back. And then there are 2 pieces of chart paper. We're asking you to answer 2 questions. What surprised you about the information that you just heard? And then the second one is, what are you still wondering about right now? So we wanted you've had some time to kind of collect your own individual questions, which we did a lot at our fact team, but then we'd put people into smaller just groups so that you could have that smaller discussion with other people that then tends to spark quite a few ideas, yeah?
Are we going horizontal or vertical?
Oh, sorry, up and down.
Okay.
Yep, so Amy, Bill, and Brian are a group, Jeff, Noah, and Kristen are a group, and then Brendan, Jane, and Heather are a group for this first one. And so, I know we're missing Jeff and we're missing Heather right now. So you guys will just be groups of two until, if Heather joins us. So you can grab either, like I said, that table, or this back table. And then once you're done with your Post-it notes, there's chart paper on the wall for you to stick them on so that we can hopefully gather some of those and start answering the questions.
Which table you want?
Whatever one you want. Brendan, you and
I know.
we are together a lot.
And you guys have about 10 minutes in these groups before we gather everyone back.
Did you use a formula, a survey? That's how do we get this number? So same, it's all part of this.
Yep.
So if you wanna just say all that whenever we share answers, did we say we're gonna share them right after breakout groups, or we're gonna share them at the very end? Okay, that's what I thought too. Okay.
Oh, yeah, it's a good group. The boys like the boys.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Those are all pieces.
Yeah, that sounds good. And he's still not, I log on to Zoom just like, kinda like watch too, and he's still not, so. Okay, well, thank you.
We got our lumber.
All right, thanks for holding down the fort.
Actually, we just had some.
Okay, bye.
They're both getting the licenses. Someone said either have to be like put cameras everywhere or sell it, get down to one house because it's just. We do have like licenses, 60s.
I'm not really shocked by any of you. I was on the 20-year
Workarounds.
That's why they rolled out.
Some form like somewhere right now, 60. Just throw it in somebody's house or car. Somebody said that like. Yeah, they're both.
Oh, yeah. I mean, things do change. So the first was yeah.
It's on the west side as you're.
All right, about 1 minute
going
left.
north. Yeah, I don't know that. Come on down Fields of Shiesty, whatever else. You take a right there. The West Shore Drive. Yeah. It's the little of it. There's a little counter, 1842.
Yeah. I just see your face. I want, yeah, we did the drainage. Although that's usually.
You 75 feet back, or do you have to start over back further?
No, it was.
Okay, if you can get your questions up here, then we're gonna try to recap some of your conversations.
But my next door neighbor's the president. When I'm gonna say no, then we're walking up my house.
His son.
Most of my questions, because they're gonna be further down the process, once we start kind of figuring everything out.
See how big it is, and I mean, when we started the committee, we were like, we're gonna do all this hands-on, and now at the end of it, we were like, there's so much here, and I'm like, we're gonna have to figure out chip.
I think
So I had mentioned, like, is there another way to how, what the heck, I was thinking about that, because right now they're looking at the old Lincoln building, and that's costing us, and I was like, that's good, we have Madison, we'll get perfect. It's really good. Either admin or PBLs.
Medicine would be big enough no, I just don't.
Well, there's 100 and some students, I was
But I think
thinking
they're anticipating that
to go up.
system's gonna.
Well, we got
Okay, so we'll do a quick bit of recap kind of on where we are so far. The big surprises were the cost of the CIP improvements and the age of the buildings. And for some people, those weren't necessarily surprises. We all knew those were kind of big numbers. I think the actual numbers, even when we saw them, have you pause for a second. So those were kind of the big surprises that people had heard so far. There's a lot of questions about getting some information from the FACT team. And in our next workshop, intentionally broke it up so that you guys weren't trying to hear all of this in one evening. But in our next meeting, some of the members of FACT will be here to just kind of talk through, this was my experience at FACT, and share a bit of where they came to some of the things that they were willing to support as we went forward. And then there's a couple of other questions around how do you get community involvement? What's the dollar amount that the community would support? And all of that kind of comes out of the process of some of the next steps that we have going forward. The one question that we don't know the answer to yet is how will the state budget help offset any tax increases? And that is the great unknown at the present moment. And so hopefully it would be, depending on the timing, advantageous for us, but we don't know that for sure just yet.
And we have our.
Yeah,
beautiful
exactly, so
financial advisor.
perfect.
So we can, Mike, if you want to speak a little bit more to that, and then we can
Sure.
add in.
It's hard to project over multiple years, because if you do a borrowing for 15, 20 years, what the impact is gonna be. But we can speak to the fact that this current state budget was just approved, does increase school funding, which will, for the purpose of alleviating taxpayer burden. Now, it varies by district, and it'll depend on how much every district in the state for the 2021 school year spent. That's part of the calculation, how they just distribute the aid. But we do envision the next couple of years being favorable for most school districts, the majority of school districts, in terms of lowering property tax burden with the state aid. Beyond that, we really can't speak to, but if they commit to the 2/3 funding, that should maintain going forward, but for how long, it really depends on how much revenue the state realizes, so.
I think it's more of a question for Deidre and Caitlin. Do we know of any other school districts gearing up for something like this?
I was gonna say, that's actually a better question for Matt than it is for Caitlin and I.
Yeah, I'll say many, generally
Okay.
across the state. You know, historically, you think you have not done a facility or capital referendum for many, many years, and we're gonna get to that in a little while, just in terms of the last major investment. The majority of school districts in Wisconsin, Mike, would you say, just get 50 to 70% of school districts have pursued a capital referendum in the last 10 to 15 years or more?
I think definitely 10, 15 years, I'd say 50, 60%, some multiple times.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see in '22, the districts we're working with, no one's passed resolutions yet, but I think that'll be a high number in 2022. I think part of that's carrying over because some people put on hold during, COVID and
Yeah.
things like that.
Thank you.
The other thing I would say, just to normalize a little bit, is similar districts. Oshkosh just passed a large referendum with a specific focus on right sizing and consolidation. La Crosse is in process. They're a little bit behind you in terms of where they're at, but they're in a very similar situation with, they've experienced their declining enrollment. They feel they're relatively stabilized now, so now they're talking about a larger long-term plan. Neenah has done some of that work. Sheboygan has closed a number of schools. Waukesha invested in their middle schools recently and is actually now having conversations about what to do at the elementary level. So again, it doesn't make it, that's not the reason you're doing it.
Oh, no, it's
Hopefully it
just, yeah.
normalizes a little bit that almost every district that is similar to you in terms of your size, your geography to a larger urbanized area is experiencing something similar in going through this process as well.
No, I actually see it as a positive to say these districts are trying, so.
What is our plan for, if we're gonna idling schools, 4 or 5, let's say, and depending upon some of these plans, what is our plan moving forward for these particular properties, and what could be our investment, or return on our investment? If we do sell, are we looking to sell some of these properties? Because I know some of these schools are probably in areas that could be used for some residential apartments, retirement home type stuff, you know, so
Yep.
there's some things, do we have a dollar amount on what we estimate that we could maybe bring in?
Not yet, and that's a little bit further kind of down the process. One of the questions was, there's obviously some thought around which schools would idle and which schools wouldn't. One thing that was really important to the FAC team, and they'll speak to that when some of the members are here next week, really was the equity across our district and the distance then that some of the schools are gonna be, the lack of green space at a lot of our east side schools. So what the potential is with some schools that may end up being idled, you know, that's kind of a wide open gamut at the present moment. The one thing you don't wanna do is have it go to a competing organization, right? So if you were gonna sell something, you don't wanna sell it to a charter or something, you know, somebody else that's gonna compete for enrollment. And so those are all things that are pretty much farther down the line from where we are right now, but things that we talked about quite a bit at FAC that we'll talk a little bit more about as you guys go through the series of the next 3 workshops. At the end of the night tonight, I'm also gonna send you another Google Sheet that has just an FAQ. So as you're thinking this over, and as you go down the rabbit hole of so much of this information, once you get into it, you're gonna come up with more and more questions that you really think, oh gosh, I hadn't thought about that when we were talking about it, but then I went home and, you know, told somebody else and they said, well, did you think about this? So we'll send out an FAQ so you guys can all see the questions that are being asked of you know, of the whole group. And then that'll help us make sure that in the next couple of presentations, we're bringing back some information that maybe would really help the board figure out our next steps for us as a school district. And then the last question that was just on these forms was about the K-8 configuration. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of keep moving along. All right. Pass it back.
All right, we will jump back in and move through our second foundational work for this evening. So the next set of slides that we're going to go through is additional information on site and building considerations. So after FACT went through all the background work related to condition assessment and beginning to explore pathways, they also wanted more information on specific sites and aspects of them. Now, this didn't get into close school A and keep school B open, but it was, again, foundational information that they used as they began to prepare their recommendation. So some of this is probably known, but we're documenting for those in the community that don't know, and some, in fact, you know, specifically where you as a school district own property, what that property is. So our 17 total school buildings, where are they located? You'll see this map throughout now. The blue dashed line around the perimeter is the school district boundary. And then the yellow lines are your municipal boundaries. So West Dallas, West Milwaukee, New Berlin, and Greenfield are shown here with the yellow dashed line boundaries. So trying to make sure that we're looking at all of your school buildings, 17 in total, on this map. Same thing on the next map, really was just looking at specifically which school is located where. So that's slide 33. Slide 34 was where we started to work with them on, in fact, asked a lot of great questions. You know, which sites have land available for expansion or would be logical for expansion? You know, we have the municipal consideration factor, so we need to make sure that we're keeping schools in our communities. Classroom quantity, building investment assets. So a lot of this some of this was foundational information we brought to FACT. Others they asked us to provide additional information on because they needed it to help clarify as they were doing their work. So one of the things which was discussed was, you know, which sites that we currently own, schools in this case, would be potential options for expansion. You can see up on the screen the schools Franklin through Hale. Are schools that were good in terms of potential availability for expansion. And then the 5 buildings, Horace Mann through Central, had more challenging sites. Probably some of those aren't surprising, right? I don't know that anybody's sitting here saying, wow, Central, tough to expand, right? It's a relatively obvious one. This wasn't, to be very clear, this was not a quantitative analysis. We didn't say if you were a school of X acres or less, you were minimal, or Y acres or more, you were available. It really was a bit more of a qualitative evaluation of some sites might be smaller, but they had robust parking available in adjacent streets and public ways, and so we were able to then plan and reserve some of that existing property for hardscape playgrounds, green space, expansion of buildings, things that would be needed to support an elementary school, for example. Others weren't that, whereby we had bad on-street parking, didn't have it available in our adjacent neighborhoods, and in turn we needed to take some property to consider for parking and other things on site. So don't look at this and just say, well, what was the parameter? It wasn't quite that simple. There was a lot of factors that went into this. I could see somebody wanting to debate one should be down, one should be up. I totally understand. It was just more of a qualitative, as I said, evaluation of which sites seemed logical to consider for expansion and which ones had more challenges associated with them. The municipal considerations, of course, we've talked quite a bit. We have Pershing in West Milwaukee, the village, and Hoover sits over in New Berlin, and the remainder of our school buildings sit in West Allis. So, probably not a huge surprise there, but I think we are informed, and we take some of this for granted. Somebody asked before about how are we going to educate and inform. I think a lot of this background information is going to be new to many, and so a lot of this is just great work that FAC needed to do what they're doing, but it's also going to be critically important as we continue to have conversations with the community that they understand this foundational information. As Mark alluded to and talked through is the capital improvement plan, or the CIP cost. This is another formula that is often used when we're looking at school buildings. What is the capital improvement cost for a building relative to a replacement cost? So the C.G. Schmidt team did an evaluation of which of our schools would fall less than 30% of the total cost of replacement is needed in CIP dollars, and then which are greater than 80%. So we had two schools, West Milwaukee Intermediate and Hale, that have less than 30% of their estimated replacement value in capital improvement needs. And we had two buildings, Longfellow and Wilson, that were greater than 80%. So you may say, what does that mean? Probably less than 30% says, right, those are logical buildings to continue investing in because we're well ahead as we get started, because their capital improvement needs are far below what a replacement cost would be. Greater than 80% doesn't mean you automatically walk away, but it's just another criteria or factor to think about, because we've got a higher burden or a higher first cost to get started if we are to keep those buildings in our inventory in the long run. We looked today again, the other schools ranged, upper 40s to upper 50s and a variety of different percentages, but these were the two kind of extremes, below 30 and above 80, and then the others fell in a variety of other percentages. We also looked at classroom quantity, and this was actually a document that we brought originally to FACT, and they actually challenged us to think about this differently, which was great, and it was really helpful. So this is a revised version of what we originally shared with FACT and had a great conversation on. When we looked at elementary schools, we were looking at schools that had greater than 25 classrooms available. And intermediates and high schools were looking at 50% more classroom spaces than the other buildings, meaning the other intermediate schools or the other high school in the district. And so we've obviously got 5 buildings here on the screen, Hoover down to Frank Lloyd Wright, that fall into that category of having greater than 25 classrooms at the elementary level, and Frank Lloyd Wright having 50% more than the other buildings. Again, if you know the buildings, that's probably somewhat apparent, especially when it comes to Frank Lloyd Wright, given the size of that building by comparison to our other 2 intermediate schools. But it was another lens that FACT was using as they looked at buildings. And then which, in this case, of our elementary schools had 15 or less classrooms. And so we had 4 schools, Franklin through Pershing, as you can see, that fell in that category. So this was just a quantification of classroom quantity that the FACT group used as they were beginning to think about what the future of some of these specific school buildings could be. They also did a great job asking more questions about, what were the most recent investments we made, and I think this was a kind of a conversation we just had. But we have, in the last 25 years, and you can see the years behind from Jefferson down to Hale, what was the last investment or major addition or renovation made to the school building? So you can see we have 7 schools on the screen that have received a major addition or renovation within the past 25 years. It's important to note this isn't the lighting project we talked about before. This isn't routine capital improvements that were made. This would have been some sort of significant expansion of or reconfiguration of existing space. So with 17 schools, having 7 of them, if I'm counting correctly, having been touched in the last 25 years in a major way, there's probably a direct correlation between that and some of the capital improvement needs that we're seeing in the earlier conversations as well. But again, another lens that FACT used to look at. They also did a great job asking about what are some unique building assets that we might want to consider when we're talking about school buildings. And so each of the schools you see, the 6 buildings you see on the screen, have some combination of a field house, a pool, or an auditorium. Field house is defined a little bit unique here. It's really just a larger gym, 1 court, 2 courts or more. This doesn't consider sometimes we're using terminology field house for some of our detached buildings that are supporting playground activities and other things. This really is more gymnasiums through the lens of field houses, not some of our other classroom-sized buildings that are sometimes referred to as field houses in the community. But again, a variety of amenities of pools, auditoriums, and field houses were considerations for FACT. And then just general age, so which buildings had an original construction of 1945 or earlier, and you can see the names listed here. Interesting, or maybe obvious. It kind of worked east to west, right? As you can see on the map, generally our original schools were more central to east side of the district, and then I can imagine as we grew west, we built more facilities and started to use them as we grew west. But again, just base age, original age of structure shown here. And then finally, tried to summarize all of that into kind of a green, yellow, red, which are priority sites, which are neutral sites, and which are challenging sites. And this really is summed up as a plus or minus equation. So when you see Franklin, it happens to just have 2 negatives for classroom quantity and original building age. It's a plus for available site, so that's why it was a -1 in that case. Things that don't have pluses or minuses were neutral, and so they didn't add to it. Again, this is not a quantitative exercise. Again, you could say that if something's got 3 pluses and 3 pluses and 4 minuses, but it got a bunch of neutrals, it might be a better site for you as well. So, but it was another way to try to summarize all of that additional work that was just done and work that the FACT asked for to put in a single place, kind of what sites are potentially priority, which are neutral, and which are challenging. So that is it for the presentation.
So we'll do another small group breakout session. You'll do a similar activity with your Post-it notes. So you're going to jot down what surprised you, what you're still wondering. We'll come and report out from our small group, and then we have time dedicated to a large group discussion. So we discuss what we worked through tonight. We can go through additional questions, and anything else you need to add.
Yep, so we broke up the groups a little bit again this time, just so you're talking to different people as we go through these. So it'll be Amy and Noah together, Jane and Bill together, and then Brendan, Brian, and Kristen together for this next 10-minute breakout.
Can you switch groups?
With that,
We don't.
A couple of the surprises, Franklin having less than 15 classrooms, it seemed bigger. That is one we went back and forth on a few times as a fact group, because there was some discussion about Franklin and its size and all of those pieces. So that is accurate to that usable space. And then Wilson needing so much work done and having had the most recent work done. So I don't know if somebody can clarify that one.
Was it the
Steve
field
might
house?
be the best, okay.
With the field house, right?
Yeah.
So field house, which is
Yeah.
field house.
And Steve, if I'm correct, it's the entrance at Wilson that would be the most recent addition? Yes. Yeah. So when we put secure entrances in the buildings, that one, the office at Wilson had quite an extensive amount of work done at the front of the building to create a secure entrance. And then a couple of the questions. Sorry, go ahead. So, wait, sorry. Oh, is he? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. And then the question about reduction in open enrollment, if we are idling some schools and consolidating, and then transportation costs. So those, again, are things that will come further down the road. I've also added each of the questions that you guys have put on the Post-its to our FAQ, so we can kind of keep a running list of the questions we've had with some answers provided in there. And then we'll share that again with everybody at the end of the night tonight, so you can have a place to keep collecting those questions as we go, so that each time we come back, we can bring back some more information.
So we'll go next to, there was a question on a post that I collected earlier regarding our demographic and enrollment study. So Steve is gonna speak to that, and I'll pull that chart back up. Sorry for the scrolling. And then the second component of that question was, so you can see in the second bullet point here, where MD Offers projects over the next 15 years a 283 student resident decrease from 2020 to 2035. And how did we get to that number? So that is why we hire a firm like MD Offers who specializes. This is what they do in these enrollment studies. We're really good at projecting out to next year, even 2, maybe 3 years. But once we get beyond that within our own projections, we're not looking at birth rates. We're not looking at rental, the percentage of families that are in rental incomes that have school-aged students. That's what MD Offers does. So that's, those are all the components that they take into account as they do this analysis. And this, you know, this is an in-depth analysis that they went through over the course of time, looking at these literal birth studies and things like that to come up with their analysis. And the 283 is we were pleasantly surprised by that number because we will see a decrease, but that's not too extensive, and it levels off. So it's not, you know, a never-ending decreasing trend line. 283 isn't, in the grand scheme of things, terrible. So that's definitely an optimistic sign for us.
So yeah, to me, that makes sense on the scale of doing this now. Because if we were gonna see a drop-off of 1,500 more students over that time frame, it would make sense to wait on this until we knew where we were gonna level off. But at 283, I mean, that's noise almost at that point at the level that we're at. And so it makes sense to then undertake what we're doing right now, this effort and time and study to make sure that we're having the right number of buildings, hopefully located in the right spots, and then hopefully making them the best educational institutions that we can with the funding that we get.
Absolutely. So those are, I think we had one more Post-it. I don't know who collected that one.
Steve has something to say.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Steve. Steve, do you remember the number, when went through this enrollment analysis, we were all just curious about these new apartment complexes that were going up and how many students were coming from those? I forget the denominator, but there was one family that was coming to us out of all of these.
I think it was 80, we were talking about 84 South, the new
Yeah.
complex over there.
Yep, so that was just an interesting, tidbit for us to know that these apartment complexes that are going up aren't bringing in school-age children.
Do we take into consideration, what do we have, how many families in West Dallas enroll out right now, 1,000? How many families do we have? Roughly?
There's about 1,000 that enroll out, yep.
About
12
1,000,
Yeah,
like-
1,200.
With the idea of what we're doing and right sizing and providing our constituents with better amenities, I think with the idea of keeping these families in West Dallas, did we take into consideration those 1,000 families that
Yes.
do enroll out?
That's a really good question. Yes, and so all of the studies that we kind of do provides us with a little bit of wiggle room. We're not looking to, same way that we kind of build our staffing model is that we don't fill to 100%. So we leave ourselves that room, and that is the goal, that our resident families stay within West Dallas. So, yep, that's built into this analysis, and all of those kind of like nitty-gritty details are linked in the actual document, so we can, if anybody's interested, it's all linked online to kind of see how that piece fits in. But yes, that was certainly was part of the analysis. So at this time, we'll move into full group discussion. So questions, discussion, we'll do the best that we can to answer questions now and jot down questions that we can address in future meetings. And we have our I'll call them experts here with us tonight that worked through this all with us for the last year and a half. So open up to the board.
I want to go back to something Bill brought up before about the options for any buildings or land that we might not move forward with in some way. And I guess I just want to make the point that as we get closer to making decisions, I think having some of that information is going to be very helpful, and not just for any land that is recommended to not be moved forward with, but any that are kind of on the fringe and the peripheral from that perspective. Because I think, you could have a situation where maybe a specific parcel is worth enough that it more than offsets some of the CIP for one of the other buildings, or whatever the case may be. So I just think that's going to be important information for us to have, especially, as we're making these decisions and trying to be good stewards of our taxpayers' money.
Go ahead, yep.
Is it possible to get like a population map or density or a dot map of number of students in the surrounding area that are attending certain schools or whatever? I'm just trying to visualize some of that.
Attending our West
Yeah.
Dallas West Milwaukee schools?
Yes.
Was that part of our enrollment analysis? I feel like it was. I feel like that was part of our analysis.
That's a big folder.
That's a big folder.
We'll see if it's in here, otherwise we'll find it for you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we want to move on, and while Matt's kind of scrolling, flipping through his pages. Go ahead, Noah.
So one thing that I brought up, and something that I know wasn't discussed about in fact, but for me was something I always wanted to take care of while we did this, and that was finding a permanent home for our administration. And so I believe that Dr. Lexman had asked about evaluating some of those options that were discussed outside of FAC, but I definitely think, and I don't know if the board would agree with that or not, but when I'm making my decision about this, I would like to have a clear idea of where we're gonna go with the administration and utilizing maybe buildings or part of buildings that we're looking to idle to help fix that problem. Because right now we're outing $350,000 a year in rent that we could make, essentially a net zero in our books. And that is also a cost savings that we can bring to the community and say, as part of that, we're getting out of this building for good, and we're gonna move to our new home, which is gonna be wherever it's going to be, and hopefully something that won't add additional cost to what we're trying to do, which is to get the other buildings up to a good educational standard.
And knowing that that one was coming, there are dollars set aside for the movement of our administrative offices that aren't currently being discussed as part of the fact team work.
Yeah, the other piece I would say is we've had a lot of conversations about what could be in theory for administration. I think our thought is until we land on a pathway forward and that identifies which, if any, school buildings would be idled, we would want to make sure we consider whether one of those idled schools is the right choice for administration, or whether the other options which have been considered over time is a better avenue to take. So prioritizing now students first, what do we need to do to solve for students, and then we will, as soon as we land on a direction as a board, look at whatever schools, if any, are idle. And if that doesn't work out, we'll fall back to other options for admin as discussed. So we've been evaluating and always working towards your next renewal date, and Steve's been great to keep reminding us of that.
Yeah.
We think we've got a little bit of flexibility yet, and our thought is, if you agree, is to prioritize the student piece first. And we'll still keep in mind that we want to avoid that lease as much as possible moving forward.
Well, I just know that by the time we come to a decision on what the referendum is gonna be, to me, that's an overarching plan. That would include the administration. And so, I mean, I'm seeing me needing to know what buildings would even be feasible in that realm for me to be able to say, okay, this makes sense for me to idle this building or that building, because then we can use part or all of it to take care of another need that we have. That's me personally, anyways.
Agreed.
Go ahead, Kristen.
I recall I want to say somewhere in the last year, we had a workshop on declining enrollment, and somewhere in there, schools that just aren't going to be sustainable based on those declining enrollments. Can someone find that? Or is that something we have available to us, just kind of like a red, green, yellow, like these schools are just, we're seeing declining enrollment that are just not sustainable for the building, and I know that's something to be of consideration.
Yeah, the enrollment projections were also broken apart by elementary, intermediate, high school, and kind of by the schools. And so some of that information is in there when you dive into the binders and the deep dive of all the documents that are available for you to review too. But we can pull out some of those key pieces into a slideshow for going forward as well.
And I did have a chance to look through very quickly. This is the Roffers report, which is synthesized down to that single slide you're seeing. It's not as simple as a heat map with dots, but he breaks down the entire school district into 49 neighborhoods, as he calls them, and will give you kind of a deep dive description of how your current student enrollment is by those 49 neighborhoods and what the projections are. So it's not as simple as a single page heat map, but architect, I'd love that. That'd be a lot easier than all these numbers. But, that information is in here, and we can ask Mark if he can easily provide that, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Other questions, guys?
Go ahead.
Okay. So next steps, we talked about the survey. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that will entail, and who will be creating that, and what kinds of questions would we include, and what would that look like?
So the district has hired a third-party survey company called School Perceptions. They do school work. They've done hundreds and hundreds of these related to facility planning. What it looks like is still to be determined. That process is underway. You will hear from Bill Foster, as the owner of School Perceptions, at your next meeting about process and what does the survey process look like. And then we will then be working with Bill on a theoretical survey based on the FAC recommendation, which you'll see in draft form at the last meeting. I can give you a big picture summary. Survey's mailed to every home in the district. It has a code on it. They can take the survey online, or they can fill it out in paper and mail it back to School Perceptions. If you have more than one voter in your household, you simply call the district office. They'll give you another code to use. But the process is really proven to be very, very predictive, and they'll see margins of error as low as 2 to 3% when we get our sample size up high enough, and their typical response rates are anywhere from 17 to 20%, which doesn't seem like a lot. But what I've learned from hearing Bill talk about this for the last 10 years of my career is that once you're past 400, sounds crazy. Once you're past 400 responses, all you're really doing as you get beyond that is you're ratcheting down the margin of error. Obviously, the more the better. I mean, if we had every community member respond, that'd be the best set of data ever. But he will talk, and I'm sure he'll speak to the accuracy and the validity of the data he brings forward. I know we've experienced it in our world. We've passed 50 some odd referendums when boards listened to the results of that survey. We've only had 3 or 4 that didn't, and 3 of those 4, in those cases, those communities said, you know, I just really don't believe that data. We really need that gym, or we really need that pool, and guess what? The data was right. The community wasn't ready for that. So I think you're gonna find, and you'll learn a lot more from him, and can really drill deep next meeting about how predictive that process is.
And I put the timeline back up, the timeline screen back up, so you can see that box in the middle is that community survey. So the preparation work that goes into it, when you deploy it, when we start talking about the results, and then where those kind of fall in those next steps. In the middle of that, you're doing some community focus groups and engagement, then you're refining your options, creating your solutions based on everything that you've learned, and then you're going forward to the next steps in the process. So that's all. We added the survey piece to the timeline. Fact didn't necessarily have anything, you know, they were doing the prep work behind the scenes to get ready, but this timeline now involves our board and then some community engagement as well.
Brian, do you have a question?
I did, but I kind of answered it in my head myself. I think most of my questions are going to come as I get more information and see recommendations and so forth. So I'm just kind of processing now.
I have one that I don't want to bring up, but the scientist in me makes me. Do we have any plan in place if we push forward a referendum that fails? What, you know, there's things that have to happen, right? And part of the communication piece will be that regardless of whether we get a referendum or not, we're either going to get something new or we're going to reduce something and just deal with our old. So has there been any planning, anything drawn up to show like, well, this is what we like to do, but we didn't get the funding for it, and as such, this is what we're going to have to do?
There has not been a plan to that level of analysis. I think right now the hope is that, and honestly, we haven't even really talked about referendum. Yes, the schedule in theory allows and plans around what potential referendum dates would be. We really are trying to prepare to go to survey, not prepare to go to referendum. And that survey, who knows? If the data comes back supportive of a direction, that's a very different conversation. If it doesn't, we might just press pause and say we need to have a conversation about what fallback plans are. There are options. We want to make sure that we're implementing any first phase with a longer looking master plan in mind though. So if anything comes out of this, hopefully we can at least come out of this with here's our long range facility plan. Whether we can take a tiny bite or a big bite is really going to be what the survey is going to help us understand. And if we get a little bite, then we're going to have conversations about what other options there are on the operating side, referendum strategies, as ways to fund some more incremental improvements.
Okay.
And at the same time, some things might be happening in a parallel world. So there might be some of this all moving forward, and yet at the same time, still making the decision to consolidate a few buildings or idle a few buildings in preparation for the next phases. Because as we know, we're just running more square footage that we need. And so there's ways to reduce costs as well as seek funding opportunities to increase the educational opportunities at the same time.
And that's the
So
part-
those kind of all run a bit parallel as we get further and further down the road.
That's the part that I think is important, because sometimes I think as a community member, people might think, well, if we don't change anything, things will just continue going on as they are. And I think it's important that that communication piece is there, that things are going to change. They're going to change in some way, and whatever happens with this process is going to determine exactly how that's going to change. But change is a coming. And I think that's the thing that I want to make sure that isn't lost in this.
Right.
And it should be part of those communication pieces. Well, if we get, you know, whatever decision happens here, you know, we'd like to do this. And if the community supports that, fantastic. But if the community doesn't support that, then we're going to do this, you know, and this is the process that we're going to go through for that. And that's, I just want to make sure we're remembering the side of that coin. I really hope that we don't have to look at it, but I just want to make sure that we have it there.
Yeah, and as you're looking at some of those numbers, given the gravity of a complete overhaul, right? Obviously, that's a way longer plan than
Right.
even we originally kind of were thinking going into the process. So certain things will have to happen in the middle as we go forward as well, just to be, again, good stewards to the community on running the square footage that we don't need, as well as being able to reduce some costs in anticipation for a need for a cost going forward as well. So there's a couple of those things that can happen, again, kind of side by side.
Kind of following up on what Noah said, I think what's going to be very important as a part of that as well is the way that's communicated. Because I don't want to go through this process where it looks as though we're making any kind of threats, I guess.
Yep.
So I think we need to do a really good job of educating and saying, hey, this is what our situation is. And our options are either going to be this or this, and making sure that it comes across that way. I just want to make sure that we're very careful on that, because that could rub some people the wrong way.
For sure, yeah. And these are large questions, and it changes the roadmap of our community. And so they're important to make sure that people actually understand what we're doing to create opportunity through this whole process, should it all go, exactly as FACT is recommending and as the world all aligns the way you'd like it to. The opportunities that we're opening up for our community and for our students, that's also, we have to really communicate that part of it. Because again, even as you look at 2 high schools or 1 high school, immediately the FACT team's response was, of course we would keep 2, because that opens opportunity to learn. Actually, it doesn't. It's actually denying us opportunity by trying to spread our resources too thin. So it's better for the greater community and for the kids that we serve. That's what we're all in this for, to do it this way. And so, yes, the messaging, Brian, very, very important. You guys are going to meet a lot of new people. There are other agencies that also work on that messaging with you as well, that likely, depending on the decision of the board, that we would bring in even more expertise onto the table to say, people who have done that work in the communications world before, to assist our communications department as well, and how we want to message all of those things. So those are all resources that are out there, and we've had some, what would be feasible to include some of them in the planning. And at each stage of this, we've added more experts to the team, because again, this isn't the work any of us do for a living, but it is the work they do for a living. And so it's been really good to have them as resources throughout the process.
You're absolutely right, Brian. That's critically important. It's really hard, though, to walk the fine line.
Oh,
If
yeah.
here's what we're going to do. If not, we've all probably heard the horror stories. If you don't do X, we're going to take football away, right? We're not going there. That's not what this is about. This is about laying out realistic options to the community and helping them understand the advantages or disadvantages of those. And I think the survey piece, it's 8 pages long. It really is an interactive brochure. You really get to tell your story for the first time in that survey. And Bill is a very talented messenger and strategist as well. So I think that foundational information is going to be critical to get right. And if the community connects to it and provides responses that make sense and are in alignment, that is the basis for our message moving forward. So it's not just a survey, it's our first chance to tell the story, and we have to get that right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think really what it really boils down to is the high school question. I think that is the number one burning point in what we're doing and what we're gonna do moving forward. And I think, framing it and speaking the language and changing our language, not downsizing, right-sizing, and providing more, like you just said, providing more opportunities, and co-curriculars and all that kind of stuff. And then seeing some of the high-level ideas that potentially that are out there that we're looking to potentially do for our students is phenomenal. So that's just, obviously you guys know that, but it's just so critical in changing the perception and with piggybacking with the rise of the community and the reshaping of our community. It just makes a lot of sense doing what we're doing. And I just wanted to say thanks. This information is taking the emotional part away from it, I think, with people. And I feel like there's more, as we move on, the buckets and how we're gonna, make the conversation, frame the conversation in the way we need to frame it to get people thinking on why we're doing this, the why.
And that'll be some of what comes out of the conversation around the survey as well, Bill. It's a really good point, right? We have to have a starting place. right? And we have to get a narrow focus that helps us answer some of that for the community as well. And so that's important in that messaging, because the more focused we can be in the questions we're actually asking, the more likelihood, the higher the likelihood we're gonna get an answer that informs our practice going forward and informs our next steps. And so the framing of what's our starting point within that survey will be really, really key to moving the process, all the process forward.
Having all our kids go the same direction.
Right.
When we talk about equality and equity and stuff, it makes sense, so.
And I really like to hear that the survey has a code so that they only can take it one time. So that we make sure that data is very good, useful data, and not
Yep.
someone taking it 20 times, and
Yep.
not a person taking it 5 times, so I'm happy to hear that.
Yep. Again, there's a reason that we hire experts to do some of these things. As I'm sure we could put together a survey, but it wouldn't look anything like the one they're able to do. Or manage it at the other end and interpret it. So that is why we bring experts to the table.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Thank you for all of this.
Yeah, it's a lot. We appreciate it.
So we have a few more slides. Steve's gonna wrap up for us, so let me just get there. Alrighty, Steve, you can take it away.
Yep, and look for that
Thank you.
fact document, because that's where we'll collect all of those questions and answer the ones that we can as we go, otherwise bring more information. All of the presentations, all of that, again, are all linked right on our website for not only our board to read, for our public to read, for our public to kind of drink from the fire hose along with us as we go through this process. But if there's anything a board member would like printed, or hey, I'd really like to see a hard copy of something, just let us know that, and we can make sure that you have what you need as well. We're not printing too many more of what Mark has in front of him, which is now the new, like, owner's manual for our school district at the present moment. So we're not printing too many more of those, but you can certainly check out all those documents as you need them.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, board.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all your work on this, and motion to open, so.
We have to. No motion.
No, we just adjourned.
Yeah, we just adjourned.
They don't-
Be
doesn't
fresh off the
motion?
lake life.
Oh, you call it? Okay, motion to adjourn.
I need a second. Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned.